Hello. I hope everybody is staying safe during these crazy times of COVID-19. Today, I want to talk about the extent of racial oppression in our criminal justice system. I don't have to make elaborate arguments to explain or to show you how bad it is. I just have to go straight to the data, because these data tell a very clear and unambiguous story. They tell the story of racial oppression in the United States and the poverty and bigotry that is inherent in our criminal injustice system. So, let's start with the growth of our prison population. From 1970 to 2010, the number of incarcerated individuals in the United States went from 200,000 to 1.6 million. In 2003, over 7 million people were in jail, prison, or on probation. Of these, Blacks and Latinos accounted for 58%. 1 in 3 Black men, 1 in 6 Latinos, and 1 in 17 white men will be incarcerated over their lifetime. Now, just take a moment to let this sink in. These are important numbers. They tell us a lot about our society. They tell us that we have a system that is based on retribution, not on rehabilitation. That we have a system that will perpetuate recidivism because it groups people together. We know as sociologists about theories like differential association, about label theory, and all of those things that tell us that if you do this, you are going to create a system which will feed off of itself. But also there's a very clear story of racial injustice here and a story of punitive sentencing. For high school dropouts, this is even worse. In 2011, 33% of Black male high school dropouts were in jail or prison. The figure was 6% for Latino high school dropouts. It's incredible. An incredibly sad and terrible story. Of the 111,307 women incarcerated, which is just 6.7% of the total number of individuals incarcerated back in 2011, we saw that Black and Latino women were 2.5 to 1.5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women, respectively. So here we see these numbers that tell us without a doubt that racial profiling, racial discrimination is embedded at every level of the system. And as we read and you go through the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's chapter that we have on the color of justice, or you're reading through Matthew Desmond and Emmer Byer's work, then you will see very clearly that just as in housing, where the contact with the real estate agent was the first filter that filtered people out, Black people out of good housing, the first contact that filters Black people into prison or the criminal justice system is contact with the police. And we see this again and again. But let's continue with this data that expose the extent of oppression. Due to harsher sentencing and the war on drugs, those are the two major factors that led to our prison boom overall. The likelihood of people of any socially constructed racial category being incarcerated skyrocketed. A white high school dropout born after the civil rights movement's likelihood of imprisonment throughout their life more than doubled. It went from 4% to 11%, almost tripled. The corresponding figures, however, for Black counterparts were 17% and 60% respectively. The growth is due to harsher sentencing for nonviolent crime. while we can discuss the very important phenomena of violence in the ghetto and the the importance of concentrated poverty and disadvantage and structural factors that lead to those higher levels, what we see is that does not explain our massive prison expansion, because these are not violent people that are getting locked up. More so, for example, in Cook County, which is where Chicago is, 72% of those charged with a crime were facing drug charges. And the vast majority of those, 70%, were for possession in the lowest of the categories there. According to Human Rights Watch, which I will argue is actually a conservative organization, by 2000, the number of blacks sent to prison on drug charges had increased 23 times its 1983 figure, and that figure for Latinos had increased 22 times. Now, there is no argument that can be made that has any attachment to honesty or reason that accounts for this if it excludes the factor of racial oppression. There is no other explanation. As a matter of fact, all those other explanations, as you will see, have been controlled for in studies. So we know for a fact that the system is fundamentally racist. It is not under question. That even for whites, that number increased 8 times from 1983 to the year 2000. So we have seen a tremendous increase in incarceration across the board. Of course, you should be asking yourself, does it have to be this way? I believe if you take a look at some cross-comparison studies, or if you look at other countries, such as Norway, you will see that it does not have to be like this. As a matter of fact, our prison system cannot be explained as a serious intent to reduce crime. Because as you have seen in Desmond and Emmerbyer's case and in the new Jim Crow, in the 1970s, when people were analyzing what should be done, the recommendations were all about increasing the rehabilitative aspects of prison and those programs. But the opposite was done. The goal was to transform it into an industry and to control people where the fear of blackness was predominant. If you look at the fact that this happened and the war on drugs occurred after the 1970s and the ideas really started in the 1970s, you see that this is a continuation of a response to the civil rights movement. And also, you look at that loophole in the 13th Amendment. So we see that 75% of all people sent to prison on drug charges are either black or Latino. Now you need to keep in mind that black and Latinos make up a much smaller portion of the population. 13.4% of the U.S. population was black, while 18.3% were Latino. 60.4% were white alone. So why is that important? Well, you know that the racial disparity is obvious, even if the populations were evenly divided amongst themselves. But when you take into consideration the fact that African Americans are a minority, but yet represent a majority, that reflects extreme racial targeting and an attack against these neighborhoods and communities. So it is evidence that supports the hypothesis of people like Huey Newton that the African American community was an internally and colonized community and remains so. It is evidence of communities that are under siege. Another important point to keep in mind when looking at these extreme data is that the data frequently suggests that white youth use and deal drugs at higher rates than Black and Latino youth when any differences are suggested. And some studies have shown that white youth used cocaine 7 times more than African Americans. Or we look at the numbers of people who visit emergency rooms. Quote, and the majority of illegal drug users and dealers are white, end quote. And that quote, white youth have about 3 times the number of drug-related emergency room visits as their African American counterparts. So what I wanted to do in this short video was simply let the data speak for themselves and to bring your attention to some important numbers that tell important stories. You don't have to memorize the numbers. That's not my objective. But you do want to keep in mind how big of a systemic injustice it is, and that when somebody speaks of our criminal justice system as being racist in its essence, that this is what they're referring to. Yes, they have a colorblind mask. Yes, they come up with some colorblind excuses. And that is the other danger, right? That all of this is happening with the colorblind ideology and the colorblind mask. But nevertheless, we see that the oppression and the incarceration of young Black and Latino youth continues unabated and undeterred by any form of colorblind ideology. So we are left with a choice. The Supreme Court has closed its doors. How do we fight for change? That's up to us. I'm not sure exactly if I know how to tip the balances of power in favor of the oppressed in our society, but I know that those balances of power must be tipped. And I know that it's up to us to first become aware of the reality and then fight and struggle for change. That is up to us. I have given you a lot of material in this class, and hopefully in my other classes if you've had me, that let you know and provide you with a lot of powerful information about how unequal our society is, and it's up to us to fight for a more just and equitable society. And a good place to start is to stop harassing and incarcerating African American and Latino youth in the United States. Have a wonderful day, stay safe, and stay inside during this crazy time of COVID-19.